Thank you, Addie. Awesome. Welcome. We're so glad to have all of you joining us, and I'm sure we'll have some more folks trickle in over the next few minutes. My name is Mika Weinstein. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the CEO for Just Futures. The topic of today's webinar is worried about ICE in your 401k, what you need to know, and what you can do about it right now. While ICE or Immigrations and Customs Enforcement may have faded from the front page headlines, we know that the raids, the detentions, the family separations, the violence continues every day. And at the same time, more people are bringing scrutiny to what their retirement dollars are invested in and seeking better alignment with their values. So today we're going to talk about why and how most people with a retirement account are by default invested in companies that profit from immigration, detention, deportation, surveillance, and other related industries. And we'll be talking really pragmatically about the challenges of divestment and, despite those, what is possible if you want better alignment. Quick disclosure here, the information that we're providing today is not investment advice. This is for educational purposes. A few housekeeping items. Folks are already doing this, but please do go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat. We'd love to know who you are and why you joined the webinar today. If you're experiencing any technical difficulties, you can reach out to Zoom and use our particular webinar ID to get support. For questions throughout the webinar, we ask that you use the Q&A feature that should be in the Zoom toolbar. If you don't see it, you might need to click on the three dots that say more. We will try to keep an eye on the chat, but because we expect there to be some good flow and movement there, we might not see every question that comes in that way. So the best way to have your question seen by us will be to use that Q&A feature, and we do have some time set aside at the end of the webinar to answer questions. So Just Futures, the organization that's hosting this webinar, is a people of color-owned investment advisory firm that's driven by social justice values. We offer retirement plans, so that could be with your employer, a 401k or 403b plan. We also offer options for individuals like IRAs. And then we also do investment management for nonprofits or foundations who have reserves or endowments that they want invested in a more aligned way. As a public benefit corporation, our mission is to deliver financial solutions that support a just transition to a regenerative economy. If you aren't familiar with Just Transition, essentially it's a strategy to build economic and political power that shifts away from an economy based in extraction and exploitation and towards one that is based around mutuality, cooperation, and regeneration. And towards that end, we are partially owned by a group of 6 nonprofits that do work to organize and innovate toward a just transition. I want to give a really warm thank you to our co-sponsors today. They helped get the word out. Beneficial State Foundation, Center for Economic Democracy, Eliminating Racism and Creating Celebrating Equity, Giving Strong, Goods Unite Us, Grant Makers Concerned with Immigrants and Refugees, Headwaters Foundation for Justice, Minnesota 8, Never Again Action, New Economy Coalition, North Star Fund, Popular Democracy, the Rising Majority, Student Clinic for Immigrant Justice, the U.S. Federation of Worker-Owned Cooperatives, and VESTA. Thank you, thank you. We're so excited to see already almost 200 folks in this webinar with us. And so thank you again for helping to get the word out there. All right, you'll be hearing from a few different speakers today. I've already introduced myself. You'll also be hearing from George Guerrero. He is the Chief Investment Officer here at Just Futures. We are so lucky to have his deep expertise on our team. He brings 3 decades of experience in the financial services industry, including leadership positions in global financial firms, to ensure that our clients are in good hands. He's also the source of all the best dad jokes on our team, so if you're lucky, you might get to hear a few today. Also thrilled to have Bianca Tylek with us. She's the founder and executive director of Worth Rises, a nonprofit advocacy organization that's dedicated to dismantling the prison industry and ending the exploitation of those it touches. She is one of the nation's leading experts on the prison industry and has led numerous successful campaigns aimed at challenging the industry's economic foundations. She's also the author of The Prison Industry, How It Works and Who Profits. We'll be sharing the link if you're interested in purchasing the book later on. And, I'll just say with my own background in prison conditions work, I've long admired her tenacity and the impact of her work, and it means a great deal to feature her in this space today. All right. So just to give you a quick rundown of the agenda, and then we'll dive in. We've done the welcome, so we can check that off. Bianca will be sharing a little bit more about the corporate profiteering landscape. We'll then take a step back and talk a little bit about Retirement Investments 101 to make sure we're on the same sort of foundational page about how people end up invested in those companies. We'll share some resources for assessing exposure. We'll use Just Futures as an example of how someone at the investment advisor level might try to screen investments. And then we will talk about specific action steps that you can take around your own retirement investments, both understanding what they're invested in and making changes. And then we'll have a few minutes for Q&A at the end, and we'll close out. So I am going to hand it over now to Bianca.
Thank you so much, Mika. It's so great to be here with all of you, and thank you, Just Futures, for holding this space. So, as mentioned, hi everyone. My name is Bianca Tylek, she, her pronouns, and founder and executive director at Worth Rises. We are an organization, as Mika mentioned, that works to dismantle the prison industry and end the exploitation of people who are incarcerated and their loved ones. So let's talk a little bit about what the prison industry is and why we're all here in some sense, right? So the prison industry is an $80 billion business that is expansive and far beyond what we sort of most conventionally, I think about or talk about, which is private prisons. There are, in fact, over 4,000 corporations that are engaged in the prison industry in some form of public-private partnerships that are serving sort of this landscape. At Worth Rises, we keep a database, a corporate database that is accessible to the public if you go to worthrises.org of all of these corporations with, in fact, divestment scores and things of that sort so that you can make decisions. It's super important, I think, to understand that the prison industry is somewhat ubiquitous in our society. There is actually no real way, unless you are sort of keeping your funds under your mattress, to be really completely divested from the prison industry. And in fact, even if you are, your taxpayer dollars are being invested in the prison industry. If you went to university and relied on financial support, your endowment was likely invested in the prison industry. And today, obviously, we'll be talking about our retirement funds. Now, although the prison industry is ubiquitous throughout our economy, it does not mean that we shouldn't take steps to address different component parts of getting our funds out of supporting what is incredibly harmful carceral infrastructure. And so that is in large part what we're all here to talk about, which is what are those steps that we can be taking to get our retirement funds out of different sort of carceral investments. And let's talk about what a few of those are. I'm going to start with the one that's kind of most connected to retirement that many will recognize, and that's the name Vanguard. Vanguard is one of the largest retirement platforms and providers in the United States, and it is also the second largest investor in private prisons in the United States. For both CoreCivic and Geo Group, the nation's two largest publicly traded private prisons that are often the peak of the conversation of the prison industry, Vanguard is the largest investor. Now, it is not the only retirement system that is invested in private prisons heavily, but it is by far the largest, the most prominent, with the largest stake. And so, for example, here at Worth Rises, we are going to be launching a campaign called Drop Vanguard that we encourage folks to get engaged with the goal of getting at least 100 sort of values-based organizations, whether that be nonprofits or foundations or family offices, to drop Vanguard as their retirement platform or from their retirement offerings for mutual funds. And so I know we're going to drop all types of next steps and action items at the end, but if you go to a bit.ly link, bit.ly/ drop Vanguard, you can sort of sign up to be notified when that campaign launches and get your nonprofit organization, foundation, or family office moving in collective action with other people. But beyond Vanguard, let's talk about just some other examples of what are companies that are involved in the prison industry that you may be familiar with the name of the company, but not familiar with what they're doing. And so, obviously the most obvious, as we mentioned, are the private prisons, right? And then you get into things like surveillance, like Palantir, and those are all names that are starting to hit that the media quite heavily, right? Like you've seen these names over and over. And then you have ones that are maybe a little smaller, like Axon, who are doing the body cameras that are convincing folks on all sides of the aisle that investing in ICE is a good idea. Let's just give oversight with a body camera, and somehow that's sufficient to offset the incredible amount of harm that is happening. It's not, right? And so looking at corporations like that. There's also corporations like Aramark. Take Aramark. Aramark's a company that is engaged in the food services industry, right? They are very common provider of food in universities, hospitals, government buildings, corporate buildings. They are also a huge provider of food in prisons and jails. Now, you might ask, well, people in prison need to eat. Food can't be that awful. Well, it is when you're starving people feces, rodent body parts, rocks, and mop strings. And all of those things are actually have been cited in different lawsuits against Aramark. And yet Aramark continues making billions every year off of food in prisons and jails. You have companies like 3M. 3M, you might know them because they are the global conglomerate behind things like Post-its. But 3M is a huge supporter of prison labor. They actually help prison agencies like correctional departments stand up license plate factories inside their prisons and jails. And why does 3M have an interest in that? Because 3M sells the raw materials required for license plates. Very often we think about supply chain down the chain, but we don't think about sort of the raw materials that are being funneled into prisons and jails, knowingly used for prison labor, right? And to make matters worse, 3M then goes as far as to lobby state legislatures for laws that would require more license plates. So, for example, the frequency with which you need to get a new license plate, or the fact that you might not just need a license plate on the front of your car, but also the back of your car in states where that isn't required. Those things are things that 3M lobbies on, simply so it can kind of generate that business for prisons and jails, which in turn generates its own business in terms of the raw materials that it funnels inside. So there are a number, hundreds really, of corporations that are engaged in prisons and jails in quite malicious and harmful ways. And these are the things that we really want to be thinking about. At Worth Rises, we consider our work in a number of sectors. And so that is how our corporate database online is structured. It's also how the book, The Prison Industry, How It Works and Who Profits is structured over a course of 12 chapters, each of which is dedicated to another industry. It starts with architecture, construction, goes through things like healthcare, food services, telecom, and really starts to explain who are the corporations engaged, what is the harm that they're causing, And now, most importantly, as we talk today, what is the thing that we can do? And so I want to implore everyone here and thank everyone here for being here to have this conversation, to initiate this discussion um, for many folks about what it means to actually divest our assets from this carceral infrastructure that is, leading and supporting the kidnapping of people and our neighbors off the streets, to the long haul detention or incarceration of people who are incarcerated, right? And then, one story that I just want to share before handing it back over is that I personally did this within my organization before Worth Rises. As an employee at another organization, um, came in, realized Vanguard was in fact the platform provider, and that we had a lot of Vanguard funds on our in our retirement offering, and proposed to the leadership of the organization that we change that so that our retirement accounts actually echoed the values that we said we had as an organization. And I was really glad the leadership took that suggestion and brought it to life. In fact, in less than 3 months, we had moved off of the Vanguard platform. And I say that to say that, while this stuff can feel overwhelming when we start talking about the technical aspects and the administrative aspects, it is not that difficult. And it is our duty, I think, at this point to do these things. And so I'll end on that, which is to say, right now, I think it's very easy to be hopeless in what we are seeing. And it is hopelessness that sort of is oftentimes the thing that prevents us from action. And I can see that this group in particular is obviously not dissuaded from being from taking action. And I encourage us all to have hope in this moment, because it's our duty to have hope for those who are sitting in cages all across the United States. And with that, I will pass it back to Mika and say thank you so much.
Thank you, Bianca. Thank you so much for sharing and for your remarks. I'm going to actually pass it over to George right now, and I'm going to go ahead and put slides back on the screen. Take it away, George.
Okay, great. Thanks, Mika, and thank you, Bianca. So we thought it would be good to level set with a grounding on how retirement investing typically works and connect dots with some of what Bianca just shared. So most of us probably view our retirement savings as a little bit of a black box. You see a number on a screen or a monthly contribution on a pay stub, and we trust the system is working to grow that number for our future. But increasingly, more people, like yourselves, are asking a critical question. What am I actually supporting with my money? Now, specifically in the context of our discussion today, we are looking at how public companies with ICE contracts end up in our retirement portfolios. Now to understand that better, we are going to take a step back and have a look under the hood of the most fundamental rule in investing, asset diversification. Now, our goal here isn't just to talk about finance, but to bridge the gap between your personal savings and the global corporate web. Now, to understand how we get such broad exposures, we have to start with the old eggs and baskets problem. On the left-hand side of the slide, you see the biggest risk in the financial world, concentration. If you put all of your money into a single company, you are carrying one giant egg in one giant basket. And if that company fails, or if that specific sector hits a crisis, your entire retirement future is at risk. That's very high stakes. And for most of us, it's a wager that is probably far too dangerous. Now, to fix this, the investing world prescribes more often to the model on the right, diversification. Instead of one egg, we break our investments into many, many smaller pieces, different eggs spread across different baskets, different industries, different countries, and different asset types. This way, if one basket drops, the other may remain more steady. It's the primary way we protect your nest egg, to take the egg analogy too far. But here's where the trade-off. The more baskets you own to ensure your safety, the less you know about what's inside every single one of them. Now, by trying to own everything to stay safe, you more commonly end up owning companies you might never have chosen individually. Now, in the next few slides, we're going to take a closer look at how that everything bucket is constructed and how it mechanically pulls government contractors into your personal portfolio. So on this next slide, now that we've established that putting all our eggs in one basket is a bad idea, let's talk about the vehicles that are used to move those eggs: mutual funds and exchange traded funds, better known as ETFs. Now, mutual funds and ETFs are the most predominant investment vehicle held within a retirement plan. When you contribute to your 401k or 403b, you aren't usually buying shares of a single company. You are buying a pre-packaged bundle of hundreds or even thousands of different companies. Think of a mutual fund or an ETF like a pre-mixed bag of salad. You don't have to go pick the kale, the spinach, or the arugula separately. Someone has effectively already chopped, measured, and bagged all of it for you. It's convenient, it's cost effective, and it ensures you get a bit of everything. Now, here's where the middleman effect begins. When you buy a mutual fund or an exchange traded fund, you are handing your money to a fund manager, or in many cases, a computer algorithm. Their job is to track a specific part of the market, like the S&P 500 or the tech sector. And because you are buying the package, you generally don't get to tell the manager, "Oh, hey, I want the salad, but hold on the croutons." You get exactly what's in the mix. In the world of retirement savings, these vehicles are the industry standard because they are a lot safer and more efficient. However, they create a layer of separation. You own the vehicle, but the vehicle owns the companies. Now, as we move to the next slide, we'll see how this pre-mixed approach is exactly how ICE contractors end up on your plate, even if you've never ordered them. Now, when we hear the term ICE contractor, we might often imagine a single specialized company that only works with immigration enforcement. But the reality is much more integrated into the American corporate landscape. Think of ICE not just as an agency, but as a massive consumer of infrastructure. To function, any large government agency requires the basic services that a major city or a corporation might need. This is what we call the infrastructure of ICE, and it's why these companies are so prevalent in your portfolio. It's what Bianca expanded upon in her piece. Now, as you can see on the tree, these contracts branch out into major sectors of the stock market. Tech, which is specialized software, food and health services, supply chain contributors to the carceral system, logistics, what might be airlines and transportation firms hired to move people and supplies, or the detention centers themselves, right? That have specialized facilities that detain humans. Now, why does this matter for your retirement? Because these aren't necessarily just the specialty companies that Bianca had mentioned earlier. These can also include blue chip giants, the massive stable corporations that every diversified mutual fund wants to own to ensure your financial safety. Because these companies are so large and thus provide services to the government, they sit right at the center of many major stock indices. In other words, the very thing that makes a company a safe investment for your 401k is often the same thing, its massive scale, government-backed revenue, that makes it a contractor for ICE. Now, by diversifying into this economy, you are, by definition, also potentially diversifying into the infrastructure that supports these government operations. Now, let's take a look at how that works in the next slide. To truly understand why your retirement account holds these companies, we have to look past the names of the corporations and look at the math that governs modern investing. This is the mechanical link or the index effect. Now, most of us assume that there's somebody, a human in a mahogany wood-lined office sitting in New York or London, hand-picking every stock that's in our 401k. We would like to imagine them looking at a company and saying, oh, yeah, no, this doesn't fit our values, or no, let's leave this one out. But the vast majority of retirement funds, that's simply not how it works. Most modern savings are in passive index funds that are popularized by Vanguard. These funds are run by algorithms, and those algorithms follow one primary rule, market capitalization. Market cap is a fancy way of saying how much of this company worth in the open market. The bigger the company, the more you own it within the index structure. If it is a system of financial gravity. If a tech giant represents 5% of the total economy, then 5% of your invested dollars would go to that company to accurately track the market. The algorithm doesn't ask what the company does, it only asks how big it is. So as a result, you end up with a sea of different companies. That diversified mix to represent the entire market in terms of industries, geographies, and market size. Many of the names that Bianca mentioned are part of that sea of holdings that are held inside the indexed solution. So within that index solution, you almost inevitably end up with holdings of companies that provide services to ICE. Now, when a company wins a government contract, it often increases their revenue and their stability. That makes them bigger in the eyes of the market, which can affect its market price. As they grow, the index itself automatically assigns them a larger slot in the portfolio, and the cycle repeats itself over and over. This is the paradox of scale. The very companies that are large enough to handle the massive government infrastructure contracts are the ones that show up in these indexes mechanically, right? To essentially are essential building blocks of your retirement. Now, we'll explore this concept a little bit later. So when you see a certain percent holding in a certain company, even a tiny one, it represents a fundamental tension. Alone, financially, it doesn't typically drive results. It doesn't drive your returns, and its failure wouldn't ruin your retirement, but mechanically, it is locked in. So generally speaking, most retirement plans function under the understanding that you cannot buy the safety of the whole forest without addressing a broad population of the many different trees, including the ones you might not have chosen to plant yourself. This is that, again, mechanical link, a cold mathematical connection between your savings and the global contracting web. Now let's take a look at some tools that each of you can use to help identify what that might look like within your retirement plan.
Great. Thank you, George. And before we dive into this section, I actually want to run a quick poll. So Addie from our team is going to help launch that. And the question here is, have you ever tried to find out what your 401k or other retirement fund was invested in before today, right? So go ahead and respond. I can see we're already getting a good number of responses. And we'll share those results in a moment here. And while we're waiting for people to continue to respond, I'll say, so George and Bianca have mentioned a few examples of companies that are implicated in this system. And we wanted to share some more resources and tools that give you a comprehensive look or access to more comprehensive information about who is profiting from immigrant deportation, incarceration, surveillance. It's not going to be a deep dive. It's going to be a relatively brief, high-level overview, and then we will get into more detail about how to apply your own investment situation in the action steps portion later in this webinar. Awesome. So we have a good number of responses. Addie, are you able to, I think maybe just by ending it, it will share the results, or maybe we end and then share? Awesome. Okay, so I think people can see actually, a really good portion, about 70% of the folks who are on here today have tried to do this before, and entirely A different question is how easy that was to do, how successful that was. If you want to share anecdotes in the chat, please feel free to. Another 30% or so haven't, and we hope that by sharing these resources and tools that more of those folks are able to do that after today. Okay, so I'm going to actually exit out of the slides here and tab over to, we're going to start with the database that Bianca referenced earlier that comes from Worth Rises. This is the corporate database that includes the thousands of corporations that in some form are profiting from the prison industry. And as Bianca shared, there are different filters on this site if you're interested in a particular sector, if you are only interested in publicly traded companies, if you specifically are interested in companies involved in immigration detention, you can apply those filters and see the full list here. So a really great resource. Another one we'd like to highlight is called Surveillance Watch. And by the way, I think we are dropping links to these resources in the chat as we go. Yes, thank you so much, Paku. So Surveillance Watch is focused on corporate entities that conduct or fund surveillance activities. This website similarly allows you to filter. So we're on the option focused on companies or contractors that are used by ICE, but there are other surveillance categories here that you can take a look at. I also want to share, there's been a long-running project through the American Friends Service Committee called Investigate. They offer corporate lists around occupation, genocide, and also borders. So they have a few different categories within their website: militarization of the US-Mexico border, incarceration and detention facilities, and immigrant monitoring and surveillance. And similarly, they provide a long list on their website of corporations that are implicated there. I actually meant to start from. Finally, I want to share with you the Prison Free Funds tool. And I saw in the chat we have a few folks from As You Sow who are on here attending the webinar. So this is another great educational tool that folks can use. They have a number of different issue areas. One of them is prison-free funds. And, it's pretty overwhelming to look at a list like this and try to imagine cross-referencing all of these companies with the holdings in your portfolio. This tool makes it easy. I am just going to, for simplicity, search for, very common sort of S&P 500 fund. And of course, as I'm trying to demonstrate this, it's been a little slow to load, but the idea is that you can search specific funds by name or by ticker that might be in your portfolio. And actually, I'm just gonna cheat because I had this open before and click forward in my browser here. So for this S&P 500 index fund, it will give you a breakdown, right? They have a grading system. They'll show you the exact assets that are out of that fund that are invested. You can click through to see more details about the specific corporations. If you're wondering why a corporation is listed, you can click and it will give you a little bit of details. So another helpful tool. If you're interested in the methodology, we'll also drop the methodology page link into the chat. They actually started off by using data from American Friends Service Committee, so the resource we just shared, and more recently has been using federal contracting data directly. All right, I am going to leave it there for now and pass it back to George. Yep, to use Just Futures as an example for an approach to investment screens.
Okay, groovy. Thanks again, Mika. Yeah, so as Mika just said, building upon the investing mechanics I described earlier, we thought it would be useful to walk through what that looks like through our own process here at Just Futures. As an investment advisor on a plan, we are a plan fiduciary, and we take that responsibility very seriously. And as such, we start our plan construction process using what we'll call maybe a more traditional fiduciary investment process. We examined the broad population of literally thousands of available mutual funds and exchange traded funds, evaluating them on a statistical basis across a series of qualitative and quantitative factors, some of which you see there on the screen. And it's from this analysis that we lift up upper quartile statistical performers within specific asset categories. And it's on these upper quartile performers that we then apply our value screen. And our value screens have multiple dimensions, but center on an examination of 80 plus different values factors. And each of these values factors can be categorized into 13 themes, which you can see there at the bottom of the slide. Now, our value screening process is in many ways an extension of our fiduciary process, further informing our perspective on the array of exposures within our investment models. Okay, now let's go to the next slide. Back to our total market view through mutual funds and ETFs. This slide depicts the exposures of some names that are widely cited as having contracts with ICE, some of which Bianca had mentioned earlier, and how they show up within our investment model solutions. And as you can see in this breakdown, this contractor portion within our portfolios is very small, but it isn't an absolute zero for every name. But we're still talking about fractions of a percent, sometimes as little as 0.02% of your total balance. Now, using the tools that Mika described, you can look up the exposures within your own portfolios. On balance, I think you'll probably find the figures to be a bit different. But if they are aligned with this, then obviously that's great. But at this sort of scale, just to give it in perspective, if you have $10,000 in a diversified fund, your indirect stake in a specific ICE contractor really might be worth less than the price of a cup of coffee. But again, this is this mechanical link, right? If you're thinking more broadly, the index decides what is in the bucket based on company size. The fund buys exactly what the index tells it to buy, and your contribution is spread across all of them automatically. That's what happens when you don't have a screen process. But what we're doing here at Just Futures is a little bit different than that. But again, just so you can understand what's going on in your retirement portfolio, you can have this broader index approach that Vanguard popularized in mind. Now, in this next slide here, this is where the complexity deepens. When we talk about ICE contractors, we aren't always talking about companies whose entire business is government enforcement. In fact, there are some mega cap giants, household names in tech, or cloud computing, or industrial logistics. Brands like Amazon or 3M, which Bianca had expanded upon. For these massive corporations, a contract with ICE might represent far less than 1% of their total annual revenue. It's a tiny footnote on their balance sheet. However, because the rest of their business is so successful, because they dominate the world, say, of online shopping or web services or manufacturing materials, they have a massive market cap. So this creates a difficult screening dilemma. If you try to screen out these companies because of that small, non-aligned portion of their business, you aren't just removing a contractor, you're removing that pillar of the global economy. To pull them out of your portfolio is to lose the very diversification that represents the total market. So remember that multiple basket of egg analogy. You would be emptying the basket of the most stable eggs over a sliver of revenue that the company itself considers probably incidental. Now, in some cases, your hypothetical $10,000 isn't just spread out across thousands of companies, it's spread across companies where only a tiny fraction of their work is tied to ICE. You are invested in them because of that other part, the 99+% part of their business, the part of their business that provides email, maybe your healthcare, or delivers packages to you. But mechanically, you are meant to carry that less desirable 1% part of their business along with it. Now, again, the good news here is that from a financial perspective, your personal exposure to any one contractor's legal or reputational risk is likely low because that slice is so small. However, the ethical challenge is that even though that slice is small, it is there. And because of the way these indices are built, it's mathematically difficult to own the entire market without also owning the contractors that help run ICE, unless there is some degree of intentionality to help screen for some of it. And that intentionality starts by taking action and learning about your retirement investments. So let's take a look at that, Mika, if you could.
Yeah, and actually, before we transition, I just want to sort of underscore what you're saying with a little context, George, that you know, I think one of the main takeaways here is that overall, because of how the system is structured, it is incredibly difficult to sort of line items specifically divest from particular companies, and especially if those are bigger, more established large cap companies. And even for a firm like Just Futures, whose goal is to, be a prudent fiduciary for our clients, and also try to help create as much values alignment as we can. We're very transparent about the fact that it's not possible to be quote unquote pure. I mean, this is a recurring theme you've heard from Bianca and from George, right? That it's part of the process. And our hope is that our product at least can help make it easier for more people to invest in a more aligned way without having to do all the heavy lifting of the research and work themselves. But we do have to be realistic about, what is actually possible in this space.
Yeah, the solution we provide is not a magical 100% values aligned unicorn. That really doesn't exist in today's world. But what we try to do is to provide a degree of transparency in our process, and transparency in where your hard-earned dollars are invested.
Yeah, thank you. All right, so let's move on to action steps here. So starting with knowing what you hold, right? Getting that information. So in order to actually make those assessments, you need to know what specific mutual funds or exchange traded funds are in your portfolio. And you should be able to access that information on your provider website. When I say provider, it's whoever you are operating your 401k, your 403b, your IRA, your investments through, right? You should be able to look at either investment holdings, portfolio. Those are the types of words that you should be searching for on that platform to try to see what your investments are. It might be on your statement, your quarterly statement. And specifically, you'd be looking for a ticker, which is a unique identifier for each fund. And that's usually 3 or 5 letters. For example, VFIFX is a ticker for a Vanguard target date fund. Once you have that ticker, again, prison free funds is one really helpful tool for sort of searching across the database instead of having to go in and compare yourself. But if you are interested in looking for exposure on a particular company, let's say, most funds do publish either a holdings or a portfolio page on their website, where you can sort of look through and try to find exposure to that particular company. It may be that you are having a challenge finding this information, right, the specific funds. And so we wanted to provide some sample language for you here in case you are struggling there, where you can reach out to your provider and ask, can you provide a list of all the fund names and ticker symbols in my account? Or for each fund I'm invested in, can you share a link to the fund holdings report, right? That's specific concrete language that you can use to help get that information. I'll go on that. Okay, then once you have some of that information, or even regardless, right, the goal here is not only the transparency or the understanding, it's to actually make a change to create better alignment. And there are some different options for what you can do. I'm going to start with on the personal side, right? How you go about making a change depends in part on what resources you have or what you want to spend or how much you like to do things yourself. One option is to work with a values aligned financial or investment advisor. I think in the chat, I've seen there are some financial planners or investment advisors who are here. That's going to have an associated cost, right, for their services. But there are folks out there who do this work who don't have a net worth minimum. So it's not like you have to be independently wealthy to work with someone like that. Another option is to roll over to a provider that is more aligned with your values to begin with. And so Just Futures could be an example of a provider like that, right? Where you know something about our screening process, and that gives you the confidence to shift your money over here. Another option is to do the research on your own and try to find specific funds that sort of meet what you're looking for, and then invest in them through whatever provider you're in. The note of caution I would add in that case is that you do want to be careful that ultimately the portfolio composition you end up with still reflects proper diversification, right? Just George was sharing in the beginning, you don't want to put all your eggs in one basket. The risk return profile that makes sense for you for where you are and when you will need those resources. There are folks who really like to nerd out and do it themselves. And of course, there's a reason why many folks would rather sort of delegate that to professionals. So highlighting some of that here. And then for your workplace plan, they are service provider for you, right? And so you do have the option to request better fund options from them. One point of caution there, again, talking about sort of the asset classes that George mentioned earlier, oftentimes what we see when folks request, particular better fund options is they might add one, ESG or sustainable branded large cap fund. And in that instance, it still leaves you to do a fair amount of work on your own because you don't only want to be invested in large cap, you want the diversification across mid and small size companies internationally, as the case may be. And so it's not necessarily the most accessible for folks to take advantage of those fund options if they have to do more investment management work themselves. Another option, of course, is to advocate that your workplace change providers to someone who is going to provide that better alignment off the bat. Okay, I know this is still like pretty high level in the scheme of things. There's a lot of information that we wanted to pack into this webinar, and I do want to make sure we have time for at least a few questions here. The last piece that I'll leave you with is just acknowledging, again, of course, it is so tough. We've talked about how it's not possible to achieve full alignment, the tax dollars piece, right? I was going to bring up that point as well. And so what's the point? Is there a point to doing this? And, I'd say for some people it's on principle, right? Like I want to know that I'm doing what I can or that my money isn't invested in certain companies. But Just Futures is really premised on the idea that there is an opportunity here for investor behavior to lead to change. And what needs to happen for that to be possible is for us to leverage collective power, right? So we need tools to be able to act in tandem for there to be meaningful change there. That is the thought I'll leave you with before transitioning us to Q&A.
Oh my gosh, this has been really great. Thank you all, Bianca and George and Mika, for giving us such a rich webinar, a lot to think about, a lot to chew on. Maybe some of us are fretting and maybe some of us are also like, let's get our acts together and fix some stuff. So, and to make some changes and figure out what's the best avenues for harm reduction that we can engage in. So there are some questions. We don't have a ton of time for questions, but there are some questions that we want to get to. And I actually want to start with one for Bianca. And it was one that actually Bianca answered in the Q&A in case some of you were looking, but I think it's really important. Somebody asked, are there demands being made to Vanguard that you hope they're willing to hear? Are they the largest investor in prisons just because they're so big, or are they disproportionately invested in private prisons? In other words, does moving our money that's already at Vanguard out of bad funds do as much as moving it to another platform? And I'm wondering, Bianca, if you could give us some texture and some answer about that, and maybe tell us about the campaign and your strategy and sort of what the big picture is for you here.
Sure. Thank you so much. I do want to start by saying the campaign is we're mentioning it here. We're sort of soft launching it in some places, but it is not officially launched. And we are encouraging folks to go to the bit.ly. That's again bit.ly/Vanguard and just sign up for the campaign updates to be notified when the campaign does launch. When it does, we will have a webinar where we will also share more details about that campaign. So I don't want to sort of preempt all of that, but I do want to say this. Vanguard is disproportionately invested in the private prisons because it is not the second largest investor in the entire stock market, and yet it is the second largest investor in both private prisons, right? And so it is certainly disproportionately invested. Is it also invested because of things like index funds and other things? Certainly. But there are plenty of opportunities for corporations like Vanguard's and others to also not be as invested. Fidelity is half as invested as, if actually a fraction of that, as Vanguard, and yet Fidelity is a major retirement platform. And so there are different decisions that can be made. And Vanguard, with over 10% ownership of both Geo Group and CoreCivic, is an absolutely massive investor and shareholder for them through all of our collective sort of retirement accounts. And so one, it would do a lot in sort of sending that message to Vanguard, and part of those demands are for Vanguard to obviously divest and stop disproportionately investing in private prisons or investing at all. We also think that through asset managers like Vanguard, we can pressure index funds to actually drop private prisons and similar corporations out of their index funds. We could pressure banks to stop the research behind these publicly traded companies that actually encourages investment. So there's a whole sort of litany of related strategies that are here, and perhaps sort of key amongst them all is that, oftentimes it does require targeting one institution for the rest to also get the message, right? And so even though we may not be at the same time going after every single shareholder of the private prisons in this case, going after one that is so consumer facing, because I can tell you the reason we're not going after BlackRock is because it is not as consumer facing. BlackRock is the number one owner. But it sends a message to all other retirement providers that this is not going to be tolerated. So there's quite a bit that is baked into all of that. But we think that collectively foundations and nonprofits do have quite a bit in assets to make a difference. And there was one sort of adjacent question that I'll just answer now, which is, how much money sort of has to move for it to impact Geo Group or CoreCivic? Less than you think. When you divest assets, right, stock prices go down. When the stock price goes down, the market capitalization goes down. When your market capitalization goes down, which is sort of the value, in some senses of your company, the less you're able to borrow money. And your inability to access capital markets to borrow money means you can't grow. So these things sort of all have this pretty strong ripple effect that is meaningful. And we've actually already seen it. The private prison companies' most recent earnings reports are actually quite bad, I would just say. People were pretty underwhelmed by them. And much of the rationale is sort of the animus that the public has, all these different things. And as that goes down, their share price goes down. And again, it triggers rather all of those next pieces of impact that I just mentioned. So more to come on all that. Like I said, go to bit.ly/Vanguard, sign up, and hopefully you'll join us when we do launch that campaign.
Excellent. Thank you, Bianca, for that. We don't have a ton of time left, but we have time for one more question. And this one, actually, I think Mika and George, somebody wrote, I absolutely want to divest from the prison industrial complex, the military industrial complex, ICE, fossil fuels, etc. This is a huge priority. However, I also fear not having enough to retire on or to use for large life expenses that I anticipate. The stocks I've invested in that are more morally aligned do not grow as much as these dangerous and artificially propped up MFs and ETFs. Do you have advice for increasing financial safety nets while also actually investing in the world I want to retire in? So, one of you want to take that? Both of you want to take that?
Do you want to start or do you want me to, George?
Yeah, go ahead. You can start, and I'll.
Yeah. Yeah, so the way that I always think about this, right, is there's sort of a spectrum of what it means to invest in an aligned way. And this side of the spectrum, right, would be the most aligned, and this would involve a lot of reparations and redistribution. So I don't want to say that there's no trade-off, right, when we're talking about returns and values alignment, because the distribution of capital and wealth in this country, in this world, is insanely lopsided. That being said, when we talk about public market investments, which is a sliver of the sort of the overall capital in the world, there's this persistent myth that investing in a way that aligns with values necessarily means giving up performance, and the research doesn't bear that out. George can probably give some more examples on this, but there are, when we're talking about long-term investing, which retirement investing inherently is, there's really good research from the past few decades that shows that thinking about factors like the environment, our social impact, don't necessarily lead to a lower performance, and in fact sometimes can help lower downside risk. It's a more stable portfolio. And when you think about, right, for example, a company that has a lot of labor violations is mired up in lawsuits, that costs them money, that costs money to the bottom line of their company, and that's going to reflect later with the shareholder value as well. Sorry, I got distracted looking at the chat for a second here, but let me pass it off, George, to see if you have anything else you want to add there.
No, that covers things perfectly. You may have seen in the chat, Andrew made a remark. Retirement is a long-term proposition. Different stocks may go up and down relative to what's going on outside the window, but in the long run, right, these types of companies that are more responsibly run have shown themselves to, in that long run, to outperform because of all the reasons that Mika described. There is a little bit of a misnomer on investing with a values mindset, but there's a ton of research that says over the long run, a construct where you are more mindful of how to run your company responsibly bears itself out in terms of long-term valuation.
And the other piece I'll just add there, right, is that as a company, we have a really strong ethos around accessibility. Like, we don't want people to feel like it is their like individual burden to sort of sacrifice their own long-term financial security in order to try to achieve this, idea of being pure. I think that positionality matters, right? Some people are in a better position in terms of like their personal wealth or status to be able to think about those trade-offs in a different way and like what that alignment means. The goal ultimately, of course, is for everyone, regardless of where you're starting or what your situation is, to actually have the security that every person deserves around, the things that in our society, financial security buys you, right? Health and well-being and happiness. And, we really see this just transition framework that we've talked about there. It's a transition. It's not something that we are going to jump directly from where we are to there, but we need to build the collective tools and power so that if, let's say millions of us are taking one step in this direction, that makes a much bigger difference than, just a small number of people, sprinting to this side of the spectrum. Okay, I think probably we are ready for closeout. Is that right, Paku? Okay, great. So just a few final plugs before we close out here. Thank you again so much to Bianca for joining us and George and everyone on our team. We really appreciate it. If you want to connect with us around our services or questions that we didn't have a chance to answer, we're going to put the contact form to our website in the chat, as well as a sign up link to our newsletter if you're interested in seeing more of our educational content or other events like this. If you're interested in purchasing Bianca's book on the prison industry, we're putting that link into the chat right now. Please support her. We're also going to re-put the Join the Drop Vanguard campaign link in there so folks can track and join there. And then finally, the last thing I'll mention before we close out is we've had such, really genuine interest in this topic. And the focus for today, of course, has been on retirement, but there's been interest as well in looking at what this means in endowments and organizational reserves. And so we are actually planning another webinar that is focused on that topic specifically for April. So we're going to put the registration link into the chat for that webinar. It's a different landscape, right? It's not ordinary people investing for their own long-term financial security. It's, folks who have significant wealth, and it's a less regulated environment as well, which means there's more opportunity for folks to invest in an aligned way. So we'll be talking about the specific sort of strategies and opportunities that exist there. All right. Thank you again. I know it's been shared in the chat. We will be sending the recording, the slides, resources. Thank you so much for the really engaging discussion in the chat, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, everybody.